During early 2020, I started my Unity game development journey. I had given Unity a shot before, following some basic tutorials, but never got very far. This time though, due to current events going on in the world, I decided to really give it a shot. Now I played video games most of my life, but FPS games were what really got me hooked on them, to the point where I spent thousands of hours playing them. Now most people would consider that a huge waste of time, but I realized I could use that experience to my benefit, so I decided to make an FPS game. So first I looked up how to make an FPS game and found Bracky's player movement tutorial. At this point I really have no idea what I'm doing, so I'm just copying the code line for line, and I end up with this moving capsule. Next up I needed guns. Luckily, Brackish has 2 videos on shooting guns and weapon switching. I didn't want my guns to be futuristic guns like in the tutorial, I just wanted normal guns. And conveniently, Brackish also has a modern weapons asset for everyone to download. $5? Sorry, it's hard out here. Next, I need some muzzle flash and bulletin packs for my gun. So I found a War Effects asset in the Unity asset store. After tweaking the muzzle flash a bit, I had my guns working and shooting. Now I have basic movement, shooting, reloading, and the ability to switch between pistol and primary. When people think of FPS games from the Xbox 360 era, they usually think of Call of Duty, Halo, or Battlefield. But the game that I drew most inspiration from was a long and forgotten game called Rainbow Six Vegas 2. The movement and shooting in this game was a lot different from FPS games at the time. It was more like Counter-Strike but for console. Now FPS games usually fall into 2 categories. Ones where aiming down sight is accurate, and others where hip firing is accurate. This game falls into the latter, so the current way of shooting I had was exactly what I wanted. Now in most shooter games you can only sprint forward, so usually lead to you dying if you get caught sprinting in a gunfight. But in Rainbow Six Vegas 2, you could sprint in all directions except for backwards, allowing you to use it to your advantage in gunfights. This is also a lot easier to add to my game than the typical way of sprinting. All I need to do is increase my character's speed when holding the sprint button, and rotate my gun using Unity's animator system. Next up, I need an actual character model. So I spent the next few weeks learning Blender, and with my newfound skills, I ended up making this. Now here comes the tricky part. In all FPS games, your hands attached to your guns. To do this, you need something called inverse kinematics. This basically makes the elbow joint move depending on where the hands go. I can no longer depend on Braggies for help, so I need to venture into the wild west of YouTube tutorials. So I come across 2 videos that help me, one by KiwiCoder and another by Ditzel Games. I end up not being able to get KiwiCoder's script to work on the model I made with Blender, so I end up just using the generic blue character model he's using. And after some tweaking, I finally got it to work. But that's not all. In most FPS games, you can only see your arms and not your body or head. So I end up trying to take the arms off of my model and use that, but this is what it ended up looking like. So I went back into Blender, made some arms, and put them into Unity. Then I used the same IK script to attach them to the gun, and now I finally had a working player. Initially, I actually wanted to make my game multiplayer. Seeing videos like this, I thought, maybe it's not that hard. So I made a small level using Pro Builder and looked up a Unity multiplayer solution, but soon realized that it was way too complicated for me, and it'd be better if I just stuck with single player for the time being. So for any single player game, you need enemies. First, I need the enemies to take damage and die. To do this, I just added a target script from Braggy's shooting tutorial and placed it on a character model. But the enemy just kind of disappears when he dies. Instead, I want him to ragdoll. So I look it up and find this video by Jason Weinman. I assume all I have to do is turn the model into a ragdoll, but of course it can't be that simple. What I actually have to do is have 2 models, the normal model and the ragdoll model. And when the enemy dies, basically switch their places. And here's how it looks. Good enough. Next I had to get the AI moving. To do this in Unity, you need to use nav meshes. A nav mesh basically acts as the area that the AI can move in. So first I need to add a nav mesh onto the level and then a nav mesh agent onto the enemy. Finally, I need to add some code to get the AI moving, which I totally did not steal from this video right here. And just like that, we got the enemies moving around. and if you get within their radius, they begin to follow you. So now that I had the AI moving, it was time to make a small level with it. So I decided to make a practice range like in Valorant or Counter-Strike. Using Pro Builder, I made a basic box-like level and had the enemies spawn every 2 seconds. Being the first time I worked with Unity's lighting system, it looks pretty bad, but if I worked on it now, it'd probably look just as bad. Anyways, now I had this practice range to test my enemies on. But enemies can't be enemies unless they shoot you back, so of course I had to do that next. So I realized that if I took my shooting script and had the bullets instead of come out of my camera, come out of the enemy's shooting point, it would basically work. Then I used the box collider to act as the enemy's line of sight. If the player enters it, the enemy will lock onto you and begin shooting. I then added some walking animations, and altogether, this is what it looked like. Kinda looks like the Terminator. Now that I had some working enemies, it was time to make some real levels. I wanted my first level to be something simple, so I thought of the terrorist hunt game mode from Rainbow Six, where all you have to do is kill a certain number of enemies. So I went into Pro Builder and made a map, which definitely isn't a copy of this map or anything. Now I had to figure out how to spawn enemies. I ended up making a script so that when I entered an area, enemies will spawn in specific spots that I choose. Now I had to decide where to place these spawns on the actual map, so I just kind of placed them in random spots. Then I had to work on the actual logic of the game, such as taking damage, regenerating health, how many enemies you need to kill, and deciding whether the player wins or loses. I also added some small effects, like making the screen flicker red when taking damage, and turning the camera into a ball so it rolls around after you die. Finally, I had a real working level, and altogether, this is what it looked like. This is the first point where my game felt kind of like an actual game. Before this point, all I had were a bunch of separate parts that worked individually, but I wasn't confident in making them work all together. But now, making a full game didn't seem like it was that far off. So I had one level and I needed more. I began thinking of what my next levels would be like. If I were to keep the same, kill all enemies game mode, I felt the game would get boring pretty quick. So I started looking at different single player FPS games for inspiration. Games from the early era caught my attention because they all had a basic complete a level and move on to the next one format, unlike a lot of FPS games of today. The game that was most inspirational for me was GoldenEye 007 for the N64, a widely regarded classic by many. In it, you would often have a specific objective for each level that you had to complete. I decided that that was a good way to format my own game, so I went back to the first level that I made with Pro Builder, which is this orange level. I took that and expanded it further. Now, I've got no experience in map creation, but I played a lot of FPS games, and in many FPS games, a 3-lane setup is commonplace. So that's what I decided to go with. I had 3 different pathways the player gets to choose from to reach the end of the level, while fighting enemies all along the way. I used the same spawn system as the previous level to spawn the enemies, but I also added some enemies that stand still and shoot at you for a little bit of variety. Then I added some basic upward recoil like in Rainbow Six Vegas 2. It's not like a crazy recoil pattern like in CSGO or Valorant, but I think it adds a lot to the game. Now once you reach the end, there's a package you can pick up. I could have ended the level right here, but I realized I could maximize the playtime of the level if I had the player bring it all the way back to the beginning. And of course I also spawned more enemies on the trip back. After finishing making these 2 levels, I realized they don't exactly look that great. So I decided to use something called snaps to make my next levels. Snaps basically allows you to take specifically made assets and snap them together, kind of like in Minecraft. So I downloaded the free office themed and sci-fi themed snap assets from the Unity asset store. It started with the office themed one. Office maps just seem to make for great levels in FPS games, so I wanted this level to be at least somewhat decent. I didn't really have any plan going into making it, I just kind of winged it and thought of things along the way. Basically, it's just your typical office map with cabinets, tables, and other office material used as cover. In terms of enemy placement, I remember these old pre-fire maps from CSGO, where the enemies would be placed around each corner to help you learn the angles of the map. That was kind of my thought process when deciding where to place the enemies and cover on the map itself. After that, I decided to add a second floor to my level and a couple more rooms. For this room, I was kind of going for like a cafeteria, but you know, they just try to kill you instead of serving food. And here's the classic cubicle room that exists in every office you'll ever find. After that, I basically ran out of office themed room ideas, so I just added a basement. But you also have to activate this generator to open the door to the next level. Now I really was only going to make one more map using the lab themed assets, but I remembered seeing this train level from GoldenEye. It's basically just a straight line with a lot of boxes that block your way. So I thought, I have these box assets I could use, so why not make a simple linear level like that? Because at the end of the day, all game devs just want as much low effort content as possible to add to their games. I also wanted to add something new for each level, so I made these sliding doors using Unity's action event system. Now I really didn't need to use them, but I thought it was a good opportunity to learn something new. And action events are something that can be really useful for bigger projects. Now moving on to the final level using the lab themed assets. For this level, I had the same idea as the office level where you have to activate a computer to open a door. But instead of only having one, I decided to have multiple. I end up using action events for this as well, and also a Unity event. Yes, there is a difference. I'm actually surprised I got this code to work back then, because even looking at it now, over a year later, it's still somewhat confusing. But once I got it working, if the player activates all the computers, it'll activate any event of my choosing. Now I had to add them to the level. I seem to be obsessed with having 3 of something, like having 3 pathways or 3 stories to the level. So of course I had to have 3 computers as well. So I also had to create 3 different sections of the level to put them in. Now map creation requires a lot of imagination, which I don't have. So I just decided to take inspiration from maps that I'd played before. But I did come up with this part in the middle. Now I did make the level a lot less linear than the other maps, because there are multiple objectives you need to complete, and you can complete them in any order. Finally, I had to spawn the enemies. So I had to add around 1,000 spawn points and spawn triggers all over the map and get that to work. Now for the most part, it turned out pretty well, but there were a few problems like having way too many enemies spawned at once, which I fixed by adding a limiter to how many enemies can be on the map at a single point in time. Now once it was all said and done, the final level was complete. Now before I started making this game, I was actually early into my computer science degree, but I decided to take a break from it. I didn't really know if it was what I wanted to do with my life, but once I was well into making this game, I came to the realization that learning to program for school and making games were mutually beneficial for each other. So that actually gave me the motivation to continue my comp sci degree. Now the first class I took coming back was my first data structures and algorithms course. And if you know anything about programming, that's kind of when things begin to get difficult. Now one of the things that I really wanted to add to my game was the ability to swap weapons. Now that might seem like something really basic that every game has, but for me it was pretty intimidating. I decided to use a dictionary data structure to keep track of the weapons. So what I had to do was make sure the gun I'm holding is different from the gun on the ground. Then when I click F, spawn the gun on the ground into my hands, and spawn my gun onto the ground. And make sure they're both in the exact same positions. It definitely didn't take me 10 years to figure out or anything. I also made sure that they had different fire rate, recoil, and damage, because they're different guns and stuff. And that's where I decided to be done with my game. Being my first game, I didn't really want to work on it for years and years. I just wanted to get it done with and move on. So I decided to take my game and put it on Steam. Now, I won't go into too much detail on that process, but basically it requires you to take screenshots of your game and use them as banners and logos for your Steam page. And mine ain't looking so hot. Once I was finished, I released my game on May of 2021 for $5. Not surprisingly, it didn't sell too well. I guess that's karma. After I was finished, I moved on and didn't think about it for a while. but eventually I decided to go back and make it 99 cents. Problem is, your game only gets on the front page of Steam once, so I missed my chance of getting it recognition that way. To try and think of other ways to get my game some recognition, I made a speedrun of my game and uploaded it to speedrun.com, hoping maybe I could get lucky and create a niche speedrun community for it, but that also went nowhere. But during 2022, I've seen a surge of my game development journey videos, and I thought, I made a game, so I can make a video like that. Most of them revolve around 2D games. Since I know how big FPS games are, and FPS game developers like Garbage are blowing up, I thought I could also provide my insight as an FPS game developer. And now here I am. But that's not all. 2021 to 2022, I was also working on new things. Next up, multiplayer? If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to support me, check out Gunham on Steam and my Patreon in the links in the description.